speed with which somebody adopts technology as a logistics service provider is directly related to the speed at which their cargo moves.
That was the voice of Scott Sangster, General Manager, Global Logistics Service Providers at Descartes System Group. I would have to say right now, I think that's the quote of the year for the podcast, as it can accurately sum up some of the experiences of adapting and adopting technology, especially in the maritime space. Although if you listen to earlier podcasts, we've had some guests say that actually we are adopting a little bit quicker than we're giving credit for. It's just the space requires a higher level. Take a listen to some of those guests as well. It was a great observation. If you've liked what you heard with this podcast and others, I do have a few asks. One of the easiest things for you to do, and it helps the podcast get recognized, is leave a 5-star review and some great comments about the guests. And yours truly, the host, wouldn't hurt either. If you can follow the podcast wherever you listen, that will allow you to be alerted whenever the podcast drops. And as many of the longtime listeners know, I try to do that every other week. And finally, I do have a buy me a cup of coffee page, which will help support the podcast as we continue to grow. Thank you very much for listening, and on to the conversation. Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Today's guest is Scott Sangster, General Manager, Global Logistics Service Providers at Descartes System Group. I've mentioned before that my focus has generally been on the bulk side of the business, and if you listen, you know that. I come from the tank side and, of course, talk about dry bulk as well. Today, we're going to continue our exploration into the container side, and more specifically, some new territory for the podcast, freight forwarders, as we talk about them, as well as other modes of transportation that all lead and center around ocean. The Descartes Logistics Technology Platform digitally combines the world's most expansive logistics network with the industry's broadest array of logistics management applications and the most comprehensive offering of global trade-related intelligence. This includes its advanced ocean tracking solution that supports freight forwarders across the world. We're going to talk about that and other things with Scott. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Talk to us today a little bit about what you're doing now, and maybe talk about like kind of where your focus is and kind of how that's grown and adopted over time.
Sure. Well, I guess a little bit of this starts probably 30 years ago, if you'll indulge me in going back in history a little bit. But Descartes was traditionally developing software to help shippers and logistics service providers, efficiently move freight and cargo around the world. And oftentimes, the biggest challenge was that it was an inter-enterprise problem. It was not contained within the four walls of individual customer. And so Descartes really fairly early realized that the importance of exchanging data and moving data between parties in the supply chain. So that was enabled to, allow people to enable them to execute shipments, track those shipments, report on them to their customers, et cetera. And that communication infrastructure and network really had its origin back at that time. So today, Descartes Global Logistics Network, or GLN as we call it, is the world's largest transportation network for communicating this data and helping people solve these inter-enterprise challenges that come up along with the supply chain. So that's kind of the base or the foundation of how we deliver solutions for our customers. On top of that, if I start to fast forward onto today, we're really taking that global logistics network in the advanced ocean tracking space to the next level with some real-time visibility. Obviously, as you know, supply chains can be very complex. There's a number of partners. It can be 20 to 30 or more parties involved in moving goods from Asia to the end consumer in North America, for example. And there's a lot of communication of movement of data that takes place. And many times you could argue the movement of data is as important as the actual movement of the cargo, because if it isn't to the right party at the right time in the right format, goods stop moving. And there's a supply chain interruption that could be avoided that's caused by that. So I think all of that was really highlighted by COVID. And some of the political events that are sadly going on today in different parts of the world and the disruptions that causes to the supply chain. So this is kind of one of the areas where Descartes tries to solve those problems and shine a light of visibility on what's going on in the supply chain. So it really has been, over the last couple of years where we started to evolve beyond just tracking and moving those documents, but starting to get into customer-facing enablement, digital front ends for the freight forwarder, trying to do things more efficiently with less resources. And that's kind of the evolution that we've been on here at Descartes.
One of the things that you talk about are the freight forwarders. Talk a little bit about their role, not only in your system, but in just the general supply chain that we see today. Because again, going back to my background, dry bulk, I think, or wet bulk, excuse me, and now a little bit on the dry. If you look at that, process, there's not a freight forwarder. And I think the big differentiator is that a lot of the goods that you move are consumer facing, right? Your TVs, your telephones, shoes, whatever. Whereas on the bulk, most of the time, the bulk does not go anywhere near the consumer. You have to refine the oil. You have to, even with, the cement that you get, that's closest consumer, but you still have to do some processes to get it into bags, into, your hardware store. So it's a little bit of a different process. I'd really like to hear kind of where the freight forwarder fits in and kind of their role in what you're doing and what the folks who sit on the consumer facing side of the business, how they view them.
So, and you'll indulge me in an old reference here for some of your listeners, but I look at freight forwarders as kind of being the travel agent for cargo and freight. And I know travel agents aren't what they used to be in for live space as the intermediary and the key person in coordinating all of the different parties and activities that are going on today. So, to your point, often it involves consumer goods. It involves a lot of consolidation of shipments. In the bulk space, you're booking, large volumes of goods. Maybe it's a single vessel all on one booking. And that is traditionally managed, in-house with less role and participation from a freight forwarder. But when you start looking at, I've got 10 shipments from 10 different shippers that I'm going to consolidate in a foreign port, containerize them and move them across the ocean, then deconsolidate that, arrange for final mile delivery and distribution. There's a lot of activity that goes around just in the physical, coordination of those activities, and then the documentation associated that to ensure that you have all the necessary paperwork for the goods to be allowed to move through any of the government processes that are in there. So in order to do that accurately, the freight forward plays a critical role to make sure that that's all there. And today, that's going really transitioning quite rapidly from traditionally paper-based activities to digitized activities for the freight forwarders. So it's getting those efficiencies, ensuring that everything is at the right place at the right time, that the freight forwarder plays a critical role in coordinating.
Of course, from their point of view, their job is changing. There's probably a little bit of nervousness and trepidation. And, your software has a role there. Talk a little bit about when you talk to the freight forwarders and you talk about this kind of, you even said yourself, a rapid change. What kind of feelings are you met with? Is there a lot of resistance to this? Is there some, what are you generally seeing, whether it's your solution, another solution, or just digitization in general?
Yeah, we still do receive some resistance to adoption of a digital solution suite. It's often due not to a fear of the technology, as most of the technology has been around and has been used in our own personal lives in various areas. But it really is due to the legacy processes and approaches that companies are reluctant to change, and that the individual in the seat is reluctant to change. Nobody likes change, but as people are coming into this industry and the technology is becoming more prevalent in our personal lives, I think that barrier to resistance that we really had 10 to 15 years ago has diminished significantly. And people are quite honestly more open to the adoption of technology, and starting in a younger generation, starting to be willing to look at and review processes that are in place today and question the norm and say, I know we've done it this way for 40 years, but is there a better way for us to do this? And I think we've seen a certain change in that, and an openness to adoption of tech in the last 10 to 15 years in particular.
Yeah, I think that's indicative of all, kind of areas, certainly in the maritime space and related transportation space, because we're seeing this, all over where well, I always done it this way. Why should I do it anything else? And I
Hmm.
do think there is a little bit of a fear, but what I think younger folks or people who are more adaptive to this technology, they look at it as, well, they're not replacing me. They're just making my job better. They're making my life easier. They're taking away the rubber stamp decisions that I do, automating that and allowing me to make the higher order decisions, whether or not even to enter into a contract, right? Rather than,
Yeah.
or to go out if you're a freight forwarder. I assume it sounds like it is a middleman. So, ship broker, which I was for a while. So similar type role of, I'm not chasing paper. I'm actually chasing new business. So to
Yeah.
me, if you look at it that way, I assume that that's going to be a lot
Yeah.
of parallels there.
Absolutely. When we talk to our customers, we talk about, what is it you want to do to differentiate yourself? What is it that makes you a good provider to your customer as a freight forwarder, for example? And you should do what you do best and automate the rest.
Right.
The things that everyone can do, the processes, things like that, let's make them as efficient as possible so you can focus on what differentiates you and what makes you unique, better, or sticky with your customers.
Exactly. And I think this is also extended to our to AI in navigation. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that if you look at it, there's a lot of concern about, well, they're going to just automate ships. And I used this example the other day on a podcast. If you have a VLCC, so again, I'm kind of going back to my roots of very large crude carrier, which new building is over $100 million with 2 million barrels of crude oil on it.
Mm-hmm.
You're not taking people out of the loop on that ship, right? Just the valuation alone, you do not want it floating around anywhere without people on the ship, for lack of anything else other than security and knowing that somebody's minding the shop.
Yeah.
And bringing it down to a level of a container, yeah, that's somebody's goods there, so it's going to have to always have a human in the loop for sure. Pivoting a little
Absolutely.
bit, AI, are you seeing a lot of AI on whether it's your platform or others, and kind of how that's working on what you're seeing in the supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually at a conference last weekend where probably the topic of most interest to everybody was AI. And I would almost divide it into two different pieces today as people talk about AI. And one of it is what I would call is really like OCR on steroids. So everyone attempted to do things with OCR with varying levels of success, going back into the 90s, early 2000s. But what's going on now with the companies, a lot of them out here that call themselves AI in this space, is saying, how do I use artificial intelligence, understanding context of content in documents to be able to digitize them? And that's really the first step, is to say, let's take a lot of efficiency out of rekeying all of this information. And then let's start to look at it and make decisions based upon what I see there, which is the next level of AI. So to your comment, obviously with a greater value of the vessels and the contents in this space, this was, you think about from the documentation information someone can gather, the goods classification that could be done through AI by saying, hey, in 95% of these cases with this description and this origin and this shipper, you've used this good classification. I can recommend that to you through AI, or it could be a black box without the human in the seat. And I think everyone's still, just like your example, Chris, is still at the point where they're saying, I want the human in the seat to validate it. But if I can use AI to provide them with more, better information in more timely at the point of that decision, then I think I'm in a much better position to do things accurately and correctly. We may get to the point where the efficiency gets high enough that we start to accept that and almost as a black box do that work, but it's not quite there in the forwarding and customs brokerage space yet.
Well, I think it's we have some time again for a lot of different reasons. But I do know there is, getting there is a push, or not even a push, but there are places where certain digitization of documents are being allowed. I think just recently, the UK is allowing documentations, including electronic bills of lading, which is a massive kind of change in, not having a paper BL, which is kind of really interesting. And I've learned recently that BLs have the standard 3 functions and a 4th function, which that piece of paper allows you to as collateral, you could write loans against it because of the value of the, and so how do you do that now? I think it's pretty interesting. And certainly I'm sure that you're going to be dealing with, the same or similar type of situations as well.
No, absolutely. And in other modes of transportation, you can look at the things like the electronic air waybill in the air mode, which is being, accepted by governments around the world as a valid document. It's valid just between the parties as a contract of carriage. And now it's started to be adopted and accepted by other things like the world's customs organizations, et cetera, that are allowing things to go paperless, which is, I think, a significant improvement.
Absolutely. And one of the other things, it's just talk about kind of some of the challenges that we've seen, especially in the maritime space, and that's standardization. And you kind of talked a little bit about it in a way about, having an OCR read something and do that. Standardization of documents or language even is definitely something that on the maritime space we're trying to overcome. I mean, even in something like a noon report on a ship, what is speed? How are you measuring it? What are you doing with it? Because it becomes a big part of not just the bunker, how much fuel you're burning, but of course the energy, in other words, the emissions, right? Setting aside emissions for a second, standardization, a big problem for what you see?
It's historically been a bit of a problem in a couple of areas, but if you focus on standardization just of documentation and digitization and communication, there are industry communication standards in ocean and air and that are often based upon the EDI standards that were there or IATA standards in the airspace that lay out the infrastructure for how people should communicate. Those are great. I think that, and I've been around this space around EDI for 30 some years, that I often refer to a standard as a common point for deviation, because people take those and say, well, I need to add this data element or that data element, and it gets a little bit off the standard. One of the things that we try and do as a global logistics network is to allow people to work with their legacy systems, the requirements of things that they have standardized in digital documents, and convert them and translate them in effect like an English to French translator would do to allow people to communicate. It's really saying, how does your application want to speak to the world? Let's take that in and consolidate it, manage that for you, and only give you back the language you're looking for. So that side around standardization has been ongoing for 25 plus years at least. And I think standardization in processes, especially driven by some government regulations and things like that, have also increased the adoption of standard formats and structures for digital freight.
You hit upon another really interesting topic, which I was going to ask you about, and that is, how do you deal with legacy systems? And you have some of the big shippers, for what happened, what my understanding is, you had the big shippers, the Maersk, the MSC, so on and so forth. I'm thinking again of the ocean side, and I'm sure there's the same, maybe it's DHL and FedEx on the air and so on. They all developed their own legacy systems. Yep. It sounds like you guys and the industry, maybe other players, are starting to figure out, like, you're not going to change those folks to get out of their legacy system. That's, we talked about change management. I mean, there are a couple of books about them, to say it politely, about change management. That's been a challenge, but something it sounds like you're stepping up to as well.
Historically it's been a bit of a challenge, but we know that there's people that are making selections on and creating their technology environments based upon their own requirements. And some of those historically have been people purchasing from a software provider, an ERP system, and then they go to integrate that with the next component. Well, if we come in and say, oh, we need you to throw all of that out, we're now talking about multi-million-dollar investments from an organization. Whereas what we really want to do is make their investment that they've already made more efficient. So how can I get your system communicating with the outside world? So there's lots of ways to do that data sharing through EDI, XML, flat file transfers, et cetera. Or, as technology evolves, starting to get into API calls or web services, where you can start to manage data better and interact with the other system. And for us, that's the key, is to leverage what somebody's already invested in and what is best of breed for them. And now let's make it communicate with the outside world, because as you scale, if you imagine from an ocean carrier, if they have to deal with 2,000 NVOCCs or direct shippers around the world, do they want to do each one of those connections individually? And the answer is no. They'd rather standardize it on one and then let somebody like us or the other providers out there manage that communication,
Right.
so that they can, again, to our comments earlier, they can automate those, and then they can focus on something that differentiates.
Right. And I think that that's a really interesting way to do it. Obviously, with API calls, in my current role, we do deal with that. And of course, the tricky part comes into the mapping. What's, like you said, how do I translate this from Maersk to whatever? And that gets the tricky part. And that's where the human in the loop, even if it's in a way that you don't see it, comes into play, because they're helping make those decisions, or at least map it in a way that'll help you as well. You have a really unique view in that you have a lot of different views of the different transportation modes. Again, this is a maritime podcast, but I really am curious in terms of the other transportation modes that you deal with: air, rail, inland, trucking, so on. Where is everybody in terms of their kind of digital adoption? Is there one that's like way out there so far? Is the maritime space really the last dinosaur, tongue in cheek about the name of the podcast? I'd appreciate your view, because again, I talk to maritime shipping people. I did have somebody on who was in the supply chain a little bit, talks about barging and trucking and stuff. But your view is really kind of unique. So what do you think about that in terms of where the different modes are in terms of adoption?
Yeah, we used to internally joke about the fact that the speed with which somebody adopts technology as a logistics service provider is directly related to the speed at which their cargo moves. And we saw that driven.
That is a fantastic quote. That may be the quote of the year so far.
Well, and in certain respects, that's been true with people like the integrators. So the DHLs, the FedExes. I mean, they got into shipping systems, capturing that activity right up front and all of that data, and having it seamlessly right throughout, even if they're using agents to do first mile, last mile, etc. But there became a seamless communication. And then, the air modes, rapidly after that. I think probably as you get into some of the surface transportation and modes, the other factor that plays in is not necessarily how quick a shipment moves, but how close you are to the end consumer. And so there always starts with, where's my stuff? Is it going to be here? Is it going to be here in time for me to make that manufacturing run that starts tomorrow? And so there was always that, the closer you are to the end consumer, the more interested they are in the actual ETA and arrival times. But it's all started with status. Is the customer is driven from that experience of, where's my stuff? And I want to know when it's going to be there. And now the second layer of things that we really see developing is, now how do I do it more efficiently? There's a bright light that's been shone on the supply chain, and people are saying, I need to have that transparency from end to end. So I think it started to always with status, where's my stuff? And it started to move out into, okay, now let's get the documentation done so that I can make sure that there's no interruptions.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I'd like to ask an add-on question and to dive a little bit more in parallel about the carbon footprint. Big thing in shipping, because you could directly link to 3% of all emissions directly to shipping. Now, it may only 3%, but if you look at that, you could regulate it, you can measure it. It's not, country specific. It's 3% globally. Is this something else that what you're seeing in the supply chain, people are getting interested in, or the interest, I'm sure, is high, but is it the same sort of thing, like certain parts are adopting it versus not? And how are you seeing that evolve over time? Because I think that's a really fascinating part of the overall shipping industry, especially on the supply chain.
Yeah, it's I would say the evolution of it overall is probably still in the early adopter stage right now. It is more driven from my perspective, in regulatory when there's a regulatory requirement in situations, obviously with the EU and some of the things that they're doing for starting to measure what is our impact. Then we're going to report on that. And then down the road, there's probably going to be some, insurance of people doing offsets, or maybe it's taxes or compensation for excessive use. Those things are coming, and that's what's really going to drive compliance. But we do see in the younger generation, as they start going shipping, more concern and interest in that as well. So with some of our solutions, when we're presenting freight forwarders digital front end, so that they can have their e-commerce site saying to their customers, hey, come in, look up your rates, book your shipments, track your shipments, have a full e-commerce experience from a freight forwarder. And by the way, at the same time, when you go to make your decision, we can present to you what the carbon footprint impact is going to be of that particular vessel, of that selection. You can consider that in the decision as far as how you ship. Is it only cost-based, or do I look at something and say, hey, everything else being equal, I'm going to go with the one that has lower carbon emissions? And we certainly see a lot more people interested in that. And I also, going back to the freight forwarder being that intermediary, there's going to be a requirement, I believe, for the freight forwarders to start to have to support the end shippers in and possibly the carriers for first and last mile, to say, let's look at the whole impact of that shipment in order to be able to do our necessary reporting. They're going to play a critical role in gathering that information, and these decisions were made, and these are the impacts from the carbon footprint perspective.
Absolutely. I know in the maritime space, it's, the EU ETS, which is, that charge is going to start coming into effect on January 1st. Now it's just in the EU and those goods, but it's just a matter of time before other places, in the US, maybe it's a little more subject to political things and don't want to get into it, but eventually that's going to happen. I'm a firm believer in a little bit of a play on kind of what you said with it, which is, the adoption the adoption becomes faster as whatever mode is closer to the client. I think that's also going to be something similar for the adoption of greener technologies and making that a part of the decision making. In other words, I'm a big fan. I'm a big advocate of, I have a glass, I'm going to IKEA and I can buy, flatware, whatever. I'm furnishing an apartment, and I could buy this flatware and it's going to cost me $7, or, a couple of cups or whatever. And this one is going to cost me $7.50 because the carbon footprint's lower.
Yeah.
I think that the freight forwarders especially are going to have a huge, and the whole industry is going to have a huge part of that, I think. And I don't think we're that far off.
No, it will be here sooner than some people would speculate. I would suggest, but it's going to become much more of a factor in the individual decisions that we make and the corporate decisions we make on how we ship things and how we provide services.
Yeah, and apparently I didn't realize this, but it was a big deal that Apple's going to start shipping their technology, their phones on ships, and I'm like, they didn't do that. Like to me, it was, I had a little like, really? Like they're not doing that already? Like, no, they must do it on airplanes, which has a different carbon footprint. I was fully, I had no idea. To me, it didn't make any sense. I thought only like super high end goods went on airplanes, but I guess I was wrong. One of the things that you keep coming back to, which I really appreciate, is talking about, newer people coming into the industry, newer folks. If you somebody out there, you're out there in San Diego, maybe you guys do recruiting events, and someone comes to your booth and they got other cool, maybe AI technology or other things, and you're recruiting, or you're having recruiters here. What's the story? Why should they come and join not just your company but the industry? Why would you tell them that this is a really cool place to be?
I'd probably start with, as odd as it sounds, I would start talking about thinking back to when COVID first arrived, and really like two impacts that it had. And the first one being that supply chain issues became probably an expression from our time, but became highlighted on the front page of newspapers as opposed to buried in section 3 or section 4, is supply chain became so critical, or at least people realized how critical it was. And it really shone a light on the importance of supply chain and the impact that it has on everybody's daily life at that time. I was having conversations with people that for 20 years knew that I did something around supply chain, but they had no idea what it was. So they had a lot more interest in what we were doing and why there wasn't toilet paper on their shelves, etc. So
toilet paper at Walmart, I use it all the time. I tell people, yeah, you want to know what I do, sort of? Then yeah. Toilet paper at Walmart. What are you talking about?
Yeah, and then on top of that, you have the impact of e-commerce. So obviously, e-commerce was around before COVID, but COVID accelerated everything and got everyone used to that type of an experience in their personal life. I order something online, I see when it's shipping, I can track it all the way through to when it's going to be delivered at my door, and I get a confirmation that it has been delivered. People start going back to saying, okay, I'm now going to go back to my corporate work where I'm manufacturing goods and I'm shipping them to Canada, for example. Why can't I have that experience? Why can't I purchase transportation online? Why can't I see that tracking right to end to end? Because I know it's very important that I want to get those goods there with just-in-time delivery. Those two combinations of things, I think it makes it very exciting to be in this space today, and much more so than 20 years ago or 30 years ago when I came into it around the breakfast table, because it was a family thing. So it's interesting to see that today there's a lot more focus on it, a lot more understanding of its importance, and people can see that they can take a lot more pride in what they're doing today, the impact it has on individuals, communities, etc., when they're ensuring that goods are delivered efficiently and on time. So I think it is pardon the expression, but a sexier industry now and more interesting to people now that it's been brought to the forefront.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that there's a few things that are positive. Actually, one of the other things that was a little bit positive that came out of COVID is companies' willingness to hire people remotely can bring talent. If you don't have an office in Iowa or, upstate New York or, part of Connecticut where I live, kind of upstate Connecticut, well, sorry, we're not going to hire you. You have to move to, San Diego, Stanford, wherever. Now it's like, oh, no, you just have to go to our office in Boston once a year and fine, whatever. A lot of people like that. And that kind of it improves the exposure of the business, I think. And and it also really, there's a saying that I'm sure you're familiar with, high tide raises all boats, and if you could have, better talent that's not necessarily tied to a city or a major port or a headquarters and have that talent available to you, then why not? Whether it's sales talent, whether it's dev, ops, whatever. I think there's a huge opportunity there. Plus, I think, you have people, I think we talked about this earlier, who just, love, the environment or love something else. And we're playing a more critical part in that stewardship. And it's a lot more directly related than it was 10, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. On sort of both of those points from remote workers, etc. Not only do we see that in our organization for the people that we're hiring, but also our software as a service technology and the way the technology is going allows people to do that and has opened up that employment opportunity. But also in regards to the environment, and your comment is that we've had people come to us and apply for positions within our organization that I don't think historically would have looked at us from supply chain, but of a younger generation who've come to us and said, hey, I saw on your website that you've had a tagline about making the world better through logistics, making the world a better place through logistics. And so, when it really start to think about, hey, the decisions we're making, if we can optimize and put multiple shipments for a freight forwarder into a single consolidation and get it there more efficiently, how the impact of that on the environment is drawn people to the industry that I don't think would have come 10 or 15 years ago.
Absolutely. And I think it's just you could get into a whole bunch of other issues, like it increases diversity from a lot of different ways, which always helps. I mean, there's a ton of things which really helps the industry, and which is why I'm very positive. And when people ask me, why should I go to, in my case, one of the maritime schools, I basically rattle off all those things, in addition to working on ships, which are kind of cool. But I'm sure your rail people don't think so. I know a lot of people who are into the rail and stuff. But as we start to wrap up this great conversation, love to ask people this question: what are you reading? What's on your bedside? And I'll give you a second to think about that, and I'll just talk for a second. I've had people tell me, I don't have time to read, Chris. I got 3 kids. So I do audiobooks. Interesting. That's a good one. I listen to podcasts. I just did a podcast, which will drop before this one, with a Coast Guard admiral who is in charge of one of his many charges of engineering. He reads engineering and technology papers to make sure he's up to date. So he doesn't read books. He reads current papers and stuff like that. He's an engineer by trade. This is all fascinating, and everything about alternative fuels and so on. And I've had people, say everything from classics to new books and about, current events. So what's on your bedside table, if anything?
Well, I've lately been getting into, and I'm actually rereading a book right now, but by I believe his first name is Stephen Bing. The one that I read most recently was I think it's Sun Tzu is a Sissy, and this one is The Tipping Point that I'm rereading again. And I've really enjoyed The Tipping Point, and looking at it again from how does that fit into what we're doing in the world and in the industry today. So I've always found his writing very interesting, and it draws me in. So I actually went back to that book. So I guess I dusted it off my book stand and brought it back.
Well, that's awesome. I think you're the first person to bring up that author and to bring up that. I've actually had people too, and I should have asked you this. I've had a couple of people say that they're writing books, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of fascinating. Actually, an early shout out to one of my colleagues, Richard. He wrote during COVID. He had a little bit of time, and he wrote a science fiction book. And it's one of 3 he's going to be launching it. So, but I've also had, some reporters and some other people talk about some passions that they've written about as well, which is always kind of interesting to hear what people are doing, not only with their spare time, but kind of their extra brain cells, as I like to say. So I don't have any extra. I have 3 kids and, full-time job. I'm glad I can make it to 9 o'clock every night.
Many people say I'm working on my last few brain cells, but yes,
that's all right. We got to keep them there. Well, Scott, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to kind of explain to us an interesting part of the supply chain and the maritime industry that we don't hear about. And thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate the time and enjoyed our conversation.
Absolutely.